All right, guys, so I want to give you an example of what it's like to work with me to process the emotional conflicts and the emotional traumas that are driving the physical symptoms. So recently, I just had a client who was really struggling with weight loss resistance, and they had been diagnosed with fatty liver. They were in their early 40s, and so they were considering maybe like perimenopause type symptoms. But when we looked at the German New Medicine conflicts, so for example, the liver and fatty liver is a starvation conflict. And then when we look at the kidney collecting tubules conflict, which is an air conflict, and the reason we want to look at kidney collecting tubules is because this allows us to hold on to water weight, or causes us to swell and causes our fat cells to swell and hold on to water. So the reason we looked at those two is because she's struggling with weight loss resistance. We looked at her blood sugar, it wasn't that bad. We looked at her thyroid, it was not out of range. And so we can see the physical changes that are happening in the body, fatty liver and excess body weight. So when we looked at, now let's go back to the kidney collecting tubules. This is an air conflict, right? A stands for abandonment. I is isolation. R is refugee. And E, it's AIRE, is exile. And these conflicts occur when we feel like a quote unquote fish out of water. So if you had to leave your home or your country, if you felt abandoned in any way, whether that be by your parents or your culture or your religion, if you felt very isolated, like for example during the C word, when we were all locked up and we couldn't be in our communities and we couldn't be around other people. And then also by looking at the conflict for fatty liver, which is that starvation conflict, we want to look at the timeline for when did we start gaining weight, when did we start to experience the symptoms, and we can put a timeline in and look at like how we were feeling emotionally and how we were perceiving things in our life. That is the big keyword, perception, because through the lens of German New Medicine, nothing will cause these biological adaptations to the body if it is not something that is highly acute, something that makes us feel isolated, like we cannot talk to other people about it, or something that was unexpected. Those are the three criteria. So by looking at what was happening in her life when she started to experience these symptoms with the liver, fatty liver, and starvation conflict, she had gotten really sick. And after that, she started to develop food sensitivities and food allergies. And it got to the point where she had been diagnosed with mast cell activation syndrome. Now, the illness might have been the C word. This was around 2019, like late 2019. So she was considering it because we are seeing that illness seem to be triggering a lot of mast cell activation in people. And so she thinks that maybe whatever happened at that time period, which we also looked at that illness, that's why I was using air quotes around that time period for the big life events that were happening in her life, and it made sense. But just for the sake of this video, we're just looking at fatty liver and the weight loss resistance. So during that time period where she was developing quote unquote all these allergies, the things that she was able to eat, she thought was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And she was really worried and afraid at the time that she was going to lose all of her favorite foods. She wasn't going to be able to eat anything long term. She was going to have to be on a super restrictive diet forever. She was getting into the health world, which she was not really in before. And so she started to see certain foods as toxic, that she couldn't eat them because they contain gluten, or it was high histamine. And so during this time period, she was perceiving that she could potentially starve, or she could not be able to eat the things that she want and not get enough nutrition and eventually quote unquote starve. Now you can see how this is like a far stretch. Like she didn't actually think she was legitimately going to starve any day now. But I see this a lot with people in food that get on these really restrictive diets. They're afraid they're not going to be able to eat enough, and so they will eventually lack the nutrition and starve. And so that, we figured out, was definitely really hit home for her for that starvation conflict. And then the kidney collecting tubules, this was again around the time of the C word, and she actually had not lost her job, but was threatened to be fired if she didn't get the V. So she was potentially also activating that starvation conflict because she wouldn't have been able to pay for food either. But then at the same time, she felt very exiled. She said she was the only person in her workforce that was not going to get it, and everyone was making a huge deal about it. She felt totally like an outcast. And this also really triggered some bullying that went on early on in her life that was never really dealt with or processed. And so it was kind of like opening up this old wound of feeling really outcasted, isolated, exiled, rejected. And so both of the conflicts of fatty liver and kidney collecting tubules made this perfect storm of metabolic syndrome and holding on to water weight. And we not only saw this reflected in labs, that that's what her body was doing. This is someone who was not eating processed food. They have a lot of other symptoms, and so they were really, doing all the health related things to heal. They were going outside, they were eating organic, they were eating locally from a local farm. They were sleeping well, they were moving their body, they were drinking lots of mineral rich water, the things. They were doing all of that, and they were not moving the needle. So now that we can see how the emotional perceptions were driving these physical symptoms, we then used my 5-step process, which is a combination of somatics, neuroscience, EMDR, laws of manifestation, brainwave activation. We want to get into a nice theta brainwave state before we do the whole 5-step process. And this process I teach in my new course called Feel to Heal, Transforming Triggers into Calm. The full name, but you can call it Feel to Heal, because we want to fully go in and find the truth of the situation. We want to not shut down, not be in denial. We want to look at and feel, actually really feel how we're truly feeling, instead of being like, no, I'm okay, no, it wasn't that big of a deal. And after we do that, we can use some of these neuroscience like EMDR type interventions, bilateral stimulation, to do something called amygdala depotentiation. And it's a big, long, fancy term for basically desensitizing that nervous system response, that fight or flight response from the triggers. So tracks and triggers could be the foods, tracks and triggers could be where she's living, her job, so many different things. So we want to explore everything that's involved in the conflict in that first part of the 5-step process. And then we use those interventions to desensitize those tracks and triggers from our nervous system's response. And then we can find a new way of feeling, a new way of being, a way that we wished the situation would have gone. And we can amygdala potentiate the positive things that we want in place of the things that were actually stimulating the nervous system. And so if you want to check out the course, it's feeltoheal.co, and it's introductory price right now because I just released it for $97. You can add on group coaching monthly for only $50, and that is really, really, really affordable. Cheapest it'll ever be for my intro, and that will be bi-weekly or bi-monthly. So check it out, and I hope to see you guys there.